Chapter 16 of The Eye of Osiris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Eye of Osiris by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 16. O Artemidorus, farewell. Whether or not Mr. Jellicoe was surprised to see us, it is impossible to say. His countenance, which served the ordinary purposes of a face, inasmuch as it contained the principal organs of special sense, with inlets to the alimentary and respiratory tracts, was, as an apparatus for the expression of the emotions, a total failure. To a thought reader it would have been about as helpful as the face carved upon the handle of an umbrella, a comparison suggested, perhaps, by a certain resemblance to such an object. He advanced, holding open his notebook and pencil, and having saluted us with a stiff bow and an old-fashioned flourish of his hat, shook hands rheumatically and waited for us to speak. "This is an unexpected pleasure, Mr. Jellicoe," said Miss Bellingham. "It is very good of you to say so," he replied. "And quite a coincidence that we should all happen to come here on the same day." "A coincidence, certainly," he admitted. "And if we had all happened not to come, which must have occurred frequently, that also would have been a coincidence." "I suppose it would," said she. "But I hope we are not interrupting you." "Thank you, no. I had just finished when I had the pleasure of perceiving you." "You were making some notes in reference to the case, I imagine," said I. It was an impertinent question, but with malice aforethought for the mere pleasure of hearing him evade it. "The case?" he repeated. "You are referring, perhaps, to Stevens versus the Parish Council?" "I think Dr. Berkeley was referring to the case of my uncle's will," Miss Bellingham said quite gravely, though with a suspicious dimpling about the corners of her mouth. "Indeed," said Mr. Jellicoe. "There is a case, is there? A suit?" "I mean the proceedings instituted by Mr. Hurst." "Oh, but that was merely an application to the court, and is, moreover, finished and done with. At least, so I understand. I speak, of course, subject to correction. I am not acting for Mr. Hurst, you will be pleased to remember. As a matter of fact," he continued after a brief pause, "I was just refreshing my memory as to the wording of the inscriptions on these stones, especially that of your grandfather, Francis Bellingham. It has occurred to me that if it should appear by the finding of the coroner's jury that your uncle is deceased, it would be proper and decorous that some memorial should be placed here. But as the burial ground is closed, there might be some difficulty about erecting a new monument, whereas there would probably be none in adding an inscription to one already existing. Hence these investigations. For if the inscriptions on your grandfather's stone had set forth that 'Here rests the body of Francis Bellingham,' it would have been manifestly improper to add also that of John Bellingham, son of the above. Fortunately, the inscription was more discreetly drafted, merely recording the fact that this monument is sacred to the memory of the said Francis, and not committing itself as to the whereabouts of the remains. But perhaps I am interrupting you." "No, not at all," replied Miss Bellingham, which was grossly untrue. He was interrupting me most intolerably. "We were going to the British Museum, and just looked in here on our way." "Ah," said Mr. Jellicoe. "Now I happen to be going to the museum, too, to see Dr. Norbury. I suppose that is another coincidence?" "Certainly it is," Miss Bellingham replied, and then she asked, "Shall we walk together?" And the old curmudgeon actually said yes, confound him! We returned to the Gray's Inn Road, where, as there was now room for us to walk abreast, I proceeded to indemnify myself for the lawyer's unwelcome company by leading the conversation back to the subject of the missing man. "Was there anything, Mr. Jellicoe, in Mr. John Bellingham's state of health that would make it probable that he might die suddenly?" The lawyer looked at me suspiciously for a few moments, and then remarked, "You seem to be greatly interested in John Bellingham and his affairs." "I am. My friends are deeply concerned in them, and the case itself is of more than common interest from a professional point of view." "And what is the bearing of this particular question?" "Surely it is obvious," said I. "If a missing man is known to have suffered from some affection, such as heart disease, aneurism, or arterial degeneration, likely to produce sudden death, that fact will surely be highly material to the question as to whether he is probably dead or alive." "No doubt you are right," said Mr. Jellicoe. "I have little knowledge of medical affairs, But doubtless you are right. As to the question itself, I am Mr. Bellingham's lawyer, not his doctor. His health is a matter that lies outside my jurisdiction. But you heard my evidence in court to the effect that the testator appeared, to my untutored observation, to be a healthy man. I can say no more now." "If the question is of any importance," said Miss Bellingham, "I wonder they did not call his doctor and settle it definitely. My own impression is that he was, or is, rather a strong and sound man. He certainly recovered very quickly and completely after his accident." "What accident was that?" I asked. "Oh, hasn't my father told you? It occurred while he was staying with us. He slipped from a curb and broke one of the bones of the left ankle. Somebody's fracture." "Potts?" "Yes, that was the name. Pott's fracture. And he broke both his kneecaps as well. Sir Morgan Bennett had to perform an operation, or he would have been a cripple for life. As it was, he was about again in a few weeks, apparently none the worse except for a slight weakness of the left ankle." "Could he walk upstairs?" I asked. "Oh, yes, and play golf and ride a bicycle." "You are sure he broke both kneecaps?" "Quite sure. I remember that it was mentioned as an uncommon injury, and that Sir Morgan seemed quite pleased with him for doing it." "That sounds rather libelous, but I expect he was pleased with the result of the operation. He might well be." Here there was a brief lull in the conversation, and even as I was trying to think of a poser for Mr. Jellicoe, that gentleman took the opportunity to change the subject. "Are you going to the Egyptian rooms?" he asked. "No," replied Miss Bellingham. "We are going to look at the pottery." "Ancient or modern?" "That old Fulham ware is what chiefly interests us at present, that of the 17th century. I don't know whether you call that ancient or modern." "Neither do I," said Mr. Jellicoe. "Antiquity and modernity are terms that have no fixed connotation. They are purely relative, and their application in a particular instance has to be determined by a sort of sliding scale. To a furniture collector, a Tudor chair or a Jacobean chest is ancient. To an architect, their period is modern, whereas an 11th century church is ancient. But to an Egyptologist, accustomed to remains of a vast antiquity, both are products of modern periods, separated by an insignificant interval. And I suppose," he added reflectively, "that to a geologist the traces of the very earliest dawn of human history appertain only to the recent period. Conceptions of time, like all other conceptions, are relative." "You would appear to be a disciple of Herbert Spencer," I remarked. "I am a disciple of Arthur Jellicoe, sir," he retorted, and I believed him. By the time we had reached the museum he had become almost genial, and if less amusing in this frame, he was so much more instructive and entertaining that I refrained from baiting him, and permitted him to discuss his favorite topic unhindered, especially since my companion listened with lively interest. Nor, when we entered the great hall, did he relinquish possession of us, and we followed submissively as he led the way past the winged halls of Nineveh and the great seated statues, until we found ourselves, almost without the exercise of our volition, in the upper room amidst the glaring mummy cases that had witnessed the birth of my friendship with Ruth Bellingham. "Before I leave you," said Mr. Jellicoe, "I should like to show you that mummy that we were discussing the other evening, the one, you remember, that my friend, John Bellingham, presented to the museum a little time before his disappearance. The point that I mentioned is only a trivial one, but it may become of interest hereafter if any plausible explanation should be forthcoming." He led us along the room until we arrived at the case containing John Bellingham's gift, where he halted and gazed in at the mummy with the affectionate reflectiveness of the connoisseur. "The bitumen coating was what we were discussing, Miss Bellingham," said he. "You have seen it, of course?" "Yes," she answered. "It is a dreadful disfigurement, isn't it?" "Aesthetically, it is to be deplored, but it adds a certain speculative interest to the specimen. You notice that the black coating leaves the principal decoration and the whole of the inscription untouched, which is precisely the part that one would expect to find covered up, whereas the feet and the back, which probably bore no writing, are quite thickly crusted. If you stoop down, you can see that the bitumen was dabbed freely into the lacings of the back, where it served no purpose, so that even the strings are embedded." He stooped as he spoke and peered up inquisitively at the back of the mummy, where it was visible between the supports. "Has Dr. Norbury any explanation to offer?"